Hello everyone, welcome back to the Vector W8 Garage. My name is Kurt, and today I'd like to cover a couple of items that are safety related in this automobile that are quite unique. First item we'll cover is the chassis in the car. Second item is the fuel system in the car. Back in the 1980s, when this car's chassis was being developed, it was paramount at Vector Automotive Corporation that it be a safe automobile for all who rode in it. You're going to take an individual who's not a race car driver and you're going to put him on the streets in a car capable of 242 miles per hour. The first thing that you need to consider is safety of that occupant. The car was built not like a normal street car. It really resembles a Group C race car from the era. Something very similar chassis-wise that you would have seen in something like a Porsche 962 IMSA Group C race car. So, a very unique chassis. It's a semi-aluminum monocoque chassis. It's got a 4130 chromoly roll cage in it that is fully triangulated throughout the car. It also has an aluminum honeycomb belly pan in the car, which was unheard of at the time. The belly pan itself was very expensive, very unique, and gave the automobile a very flat profile underneath, which was excellent for air movement. So from there, we'll go through and look at some of the photos, and you can see exactly how she was built and why. So the first thing you'll notice here when looking at the Vector W8's chassis is the center roll cage. This is for occupant safety. So what you see here is the actual 4130 chromoly structure that is underneath the body skin. It is fully triangulated. It is very heavily reinforced, and then if you can picture it, there's a very heavy-duty door beam that bisects the door there for side impact, which we had spoken about in an earlier video. On each end of that center occupant safety cage is the semi-aluminum monocoque portion of the chassis. What you've got are front impact beams and rear impact beams. These are crush zones that are meant to absorb the impact of another automobile running into the Vector. They are epoxy bonded and riveted together and then filled with a foam that absorbs energy. The vehicle itself, the chassis, is incredibly lightweight. It takes two normal human beings, 130 pounds or more, to pick that whole thing up. All you got to do is have two people and you can move that whole chassis around anywhere you want it to go. It's very lightweight, very rigid, very rugged, and very much built just like what you would see in a Porsche 962. Now, the next picture we have here is a Group C Porsche 962's chassis. Same scenario. It's a semi-aluminum monocoque front and rear. Not quite as much in the rear of the Porsche 962. There was a steel cage that went back around the engine and transmission versus the Vector's semi-aluminum monocoque that surrounded the engine and transmission. So the Vector carried it a step further than the Porsche race cars actually did. You'll also see the roll cage in the Porsche, very similar to what you see in the Vector. The Vector actually has more roll cage than the 962 Group C race car does. It extends all the way down to the floor pan and really encompasses and envelops the occupants in the car. So a pretty interesting comparison when you take a look at the two. Very similar in design, very much a Group C race car for the road is how the Vector was engineered. The next photograph we have here is of the Vector W8's chassis from rear view, and you can see how we hung the suspension off of the back. So we've got the Coney coilovers coming down from a crossbeam that was, a 4130 chromoly crossbeam, all welded together in a cage there to hold the rear suspension together. Very rigid
structurally very sound, and allows this car to pull up to 1.25 G on the skid pad when you adjust the suspension appropriately. And again, as I had mentioned in an earlier video, the suspension on this car is a fully adjustable suspension. So this kind of gives you a good idea of what the car looks like from the rear. You can see some of the triangulated roll cage from the back for the occupant safety cage, and that kind of illustrates the rear view of the vehicle when it was being put together. The next photos here are kind of an interior shot of the Vector as you're looking forward in the cockpit. You can also see the aluminum honeycomb floor pan here and how flat it is across the occupant area in the car. This was a very unique piece to a road-going automobile at the time. The next photograph that you'll see is the interior of the Porsche 962 Group C race car, which again is a very similar layout with the full flat floor pan for the occupants in the vehicle, and kind of a unique look at a race car versus a road-going car. The Vector very much followed the Group C style development. It was very much a race car for the road, with the same type of occupant safety that was being put into these Group C race cars at the time. The next shot you'll see here is of a pretty close to finished Vector W8 chassis as it was going through the production line at the factory. All the fuel pumps in place, engine, transmission, etc. And then following that is another shot of a Porsche 962 Group C chassis, just to kind of show you, the comparisons. Now the difference is that between the Porsche and the Vector's chassis is there's a 4130 chromoly roll cage underlying, the entire area of the Vector W8, and allows for some very nice heavy-duty suspension mounting points on the vehicle. With the 962 Porsche chassis, they literally would bolt the suspension directly to the semi-aluminum monocoque. This was great for weight savings when you have a race car that's running around a track for 100, 200 laps. But you also had a crew of 20 guys who were there to service that car at the end of the 20 laps, and all of those aluminum suspension mounts would be wallowed out, and they would pop the rivets out of them and re-rivet in brand new suspension brackets between each race, rebuild the chassis, and make sure it was ready to go for the next race, because weight is everything in a race car. Where the road-going version would be more of the Vector, had all 4130 chromoly mounts so that you could use regular suspension bushings, etc., that would last for a very long time and would not wear out in the car and the chassis after, say 500 miles or 1,000 miles, and then have to be completely rebuilt. So certain things you have to do when you deviate from doing what race cars do to going to what a road car needs, and so the suspension mounting points are a little more heavy duty in the Vector versus what they would be in a Group C race car. But just kind of an interesting take on both vehicles, and a unique development perspective as to what you needed to do to achieve a road-going car that would last the life of the man who owned it. Another important part of safety with Vector Automotive Corporation, just like in the Group C race cars, the location of the fuel cell itself for the Porsche 962s is directly behind the occupant. There's a aluminum monocoque area where the fuel bladder itself sits into in those vehicles, and just like that, there's a similar setup in the Vector. Now the Vector's is a poly tank that is filled with a foam material called Explosafe, so making it a full fuel cell, just like you would have in any race car, and making sure that it was very safe for occupants so that you wouldn't get fuel slosh and a lot of vapor being produced while cornering in the vehicle. So there's a tank that's got a lift pump in it that's behind the occupants, in between the seats and the engine out back. This is the same way that the Group C race cars were set up for the day. So you'll see a couple of the tanks sitting on top of one of the rack systems here at Vector Automotive when it was in existence. And then the final picture of the fuel tanks here is just as they were sitting up ready to go in the parts department after being assembled, and taken down to the main production area. So quite a few of them sitting up there at the time, ready to go for their future cars, and kind of a unique fuel system at the time. There weren't many other auto manufacturers who were doing a full fuel cell inside of a road-going car, so this was kind of a unique thing to have there. Very much a occupant safety related item, and again, making sure that safety was paramount at Vector Automotive Corporation. Again, keep in mind that this car passed the DOT crash testing at the highest level the DOT had ever seen in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So it was quite an achievement for an automobile at the time.
As always, I'd like to thank everybody for watching the video. If you could, please hit the like, subscribe, and share buttons. It helps us out tremendously on the channel, and it's free to you. It doesn't cost you a thing. Hopefully we'll see you on the next one.